Okay, welcome everybody to Saratoga Whiskey Club tasting number 101.
Yay!
Last week we celebrated 100 tastings. It was a pretty fun event just to get to that big milestone. But here we go. We're going to start our next century of tastings. And we're going to do it with a great one. I'm super excited to have Joshua Hatton with us. Some of you may remember it was about a year and a half ago now. I think it was in October of 2020, really in the middle of COVID. We had Jason with us from Single Cask Nation. We went through a number of really great bottlings with him, including a Milk and Honey, which was really a great whiskey. But Joshua wasn't able to join us that evening, so we are really fortunate to have him with us. He is really the founder, along with Jason, of Single Cask Nation. Many of us really love their expressions. And then he's also behind Impex. And Impex brings into the United States some really great whiskeys, and we're very excited to carry a number of them in our shop. Joshua is really well known in the industry with their podcast and with all the events that they used to do, and now with all of these incredible bottlings that come into the US. So super excited and very grateful to have him with us tonight. Thank you, Joshua, for making time for us. And he did send a number of the bottles that we're tasting tonight to us as well, to keep our costs down, which is really great. We have 8 whiskeys, or actually 7 whiskeys and a gin tonight, so quite the lineup. So I don't know, Joshua, if you want to be host, if there's anything you're going to share on the screen or not. We didn't really talk about that. If so, just let me know.
Sure.
We do have a scorecard for this tasting online if people want to go ahead and score, and then type any questions in the chat, or feel free to chime in as we go through these whiskeys tonight. And I'm super excited to learn all about Milk and Honey. So thank you again, Joshua, for coming. We're really happy to have you.
That's Vinny.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this. I could use some sharing capabilities.
Okay.
I promise you I'm not going to share a lot of stuff. I abhor PowerPoint presentations.
Okay.
But there are a few slides here and there that I'll.
Sure. So I'm going to make you host. Just keep track if anybody's trying to join, because
right.
you will be the host for that. So there might be a little pop-up that says somebody's trying to join in if they're late. So just remember that.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So you're host now.
Okay. Joseph Stalin wants to come in. Should I let him in? I don't think I should let him. So Charles, Holly, and the entire Saratoga Whiskey Club, thank you so much for having me. Charles, when you reached out a month and a half ago, whenever it was, it felt like a good way to do a makeup event. I was sad to miss the one with Jason, so I'm happy to be doing this one. So yeah, as Charles had mentioned, in addition to being a co-founder of Single Cask Nation with my partner, Jason Johnston Yellen, I'm with Impex Beverages, who's actually the importer of Single Cask Nation, but also the importer of Milk and Honey, Penderyn, Kilchoman, Port Ascaig, loads of Japanese whiskeys, rums. The list is actually kind of large. The national sales director with the company. And so firstly, really quickly, before I prattle on, please get M&H Classic into your glass. That's going to be our first pour. And just nose it, taste it, whatever. You can go at your own speed with this one, but we're not going to move past this one for a little bit. And I will talk about that in a minute. So back in 2018, I had reached out to a friend of mine, a guy by the name of Gal Granoff, who has a blog called Whiskey Israel. You may or may not know it. And the reason that I reached out to him is Jess Lomas, who is employed with Single Cask Nation, went to the whiskey show in London. And she'd just gotten back from it and had a great time. And she said, one of the best things I tasted was the milk and honey new make spirit. They didn't even have really whiskey to share yet. They had some spirit that laid in cask for a few months, and then they had their new make. And she said, you really have to check these guys out. So I reached out to Gal Granoff, who's in the same whiskey club as Tomer Gorin, who's the head distiller and head blender for the distillery, and had them put me in contact. And they ended up coming out to New York. We met with them to see if we can figure out a way to start bringing the products in. And then we took the entire Impex team out to Edinburgh. Oh, what's this? Nefario? Should I let him or her in? Okay. All right. I trust you here. Yes, James, it's the classic single malt. That's what you're pouring right now. And anyway, to make sort of a long story short, after them meeting me in New York and us taking our entire team out to Edinburgh, they happened to be in Scotland at the time, we said, we can work together. We shared a similar vision. And that vision is Impex is an independent importer that focuses on independent distilleries, but more important, focuses on distilleries where we as the importer share the same vision as the distillery. For us, it's people first, distillery second, or whiskey second, distillery second. So anyway, we started importing M&H in late 2019, and then they launched with what's in your glass right now, the M&H Classic, just a few days after the pandemic kicked in. So imagine you're a distillery, which started in sort of the mid-teens. You're a distillery who's finally come of age. You finally have a product that's at least 3 years of age, and you're ready to launch, and the entire world shuts down. Well, the good news is there's things like this. There's Zoom. So they spent their entire existence, rather than being on a plane and hopping from country to country, hopping on the computer, going from country to country to talk about this. So what you have in your glass is M&H Classic. And this is what I would call their flagship whiskey, right? This is their calling card. This is their way of saying, guys, girls, this is what we're about. This is the whiskey that we're trying to make, which is something that you would not just open for yourself, but hopefully you bring friends over, you open a bottle, you share that bottle, and you recycle it the next day because you've had a great time with your friends. Meanwhile, you've called an Uber to get home and all those sorts of things. So let's give this one a quick nose and a taste if you haven't already. And I'll go over some of the details on the distillery in just a second. So all the whiskey in here is at least 3 years and a day old. Even though they're in Israel, they follow the Scotch whiskey rules, right? They really wanted to seem that they were a world-class player like Scotland is, and India does the same, with Amrut and Paul John. They don't call their whiskey until it's 3 years and a day, despite the fact that in India and in Israel and Taiwan and some of these other hot climate countries, you lose so much more whiskey in evaporation year over year compared to Scotland. We'll go over that more in a second. But the reason I bring that up right now is to share with you, despite the fact that this is a 3-year-old whiskey, hopefully as you nose and taste this, you realize it tastes much more mature than what that age statement says. So you've got predominantly first fill bourbon casks. They primarily use MGP casks, if you're familiar with MGP bourbons, a little bit of Wild Turkey and a little bit of Buffalo Trace. And then they also include STR casks. Is everybody familiar with what an STR cask is? Okay, I don't see any hands up. I see one hand up or a finger. So an STR cask is basically, it's a process whereby you take an old cask that really isn't giving up much flavor anymore, and you're basically reinvigorating it. And so the STR process uses Portuguese wine casks. STR stands for shave, toast, and rechar. They shave out the old char, they re-toast the cask, and then they rechar the cask, and then they use that again. And so if you think about bourbon, right? Bourbon's always matured in new charred casks. You get this sort of vanilla and coconut flavors and some oak spiciness coming through. You should be finding some similar notes in this whiskey as well from those STR casks. 46% non-chill filtered, all natural color. Give it a taste.
Yeah. Okay, Joshua, you mentioned you said faster maturing because it's warmer. I mean, you get more evaporation, but you don't get the seasonal wood penetration and then coming out, the back and forth as the temperature changes. So you're getting a different type of wood contact, but it really matures faster.
Yeah, so actually you get both. You get the increased maturation and you get the change of the seasons, because in Tel Aviv, it can get, I mean, it's not going to freeze over there, but it can get to around 40 some odd degrees in the evenings during the winter time. In the summertime, you're going to be about 100 degrees or so. So you get these massive swings in temperature. So I'm glad you asked this question. I am going to share one thing with you guys. Share. Does everybody see that? Yeah. Okay. So, produced in Tel Aviv, and this is part of what I wanted to share when I said Impex and M&H Distillery share a vision. A lot of it stems too from this. If you look at the Impex portfolio, we have Kilchoman Distillery, Penderyn Distillery, M&H Distillery, Godin Carolus, which is a brewery in Belgium that started a distillery in 2010. All four of these distilleries have this man in common, Dr. Jim Swan. So Dr. Swan was, and unfortunately I say was because sadly he passed in 2017. He was the guy you would go to if you needed to start up a distillery but didn't know how to do it. He was your guru. He'd been in distillery consultation for decades, if I'm not mistaken, starting in the 80s. In the 90s, he helped Glenmorangie redesign their whiskeys. He helped Glengarry redesign their whiskeys. And then in the late 90s and early 2000s, he started helping distilleries like Penderyn, like Kavalan, like Amrut, like M&H and Penderyn and Kilchoman and so forth. So in talking with them, we had this in common. We said, okay, that's interesting. It makes sense to our portfolio. We'll come back to this in a second, but here we go. Peter, you had asked the question about maturation. So in Tel Aviv, they're getting 300 days of sunlight. And granted, the temperatures here are in Celsius, but 16 degrees is 61 Fahrenheit. And 40 degrees is sort of like the surface of the sun. It's like really hot. No, it's about 100 degrees, maybe a little bit over. And so that's the daytime in the summer. And 16 degrees Celsius or 61 is the daytime in the winter time. But it's gotten down kind of chillier than that. And it snows in Jerusalem too. And they actually mature some casks in Jerusalem. So in Scotland, you have, and this is, on to the fast maturation. In Scotland, you have an annual angel share of about 2% year over year. The casks that are maturing in Tel Aviv is 10 to 12% every year. And the casks that they're storing at the Dead Sea, here, the lowest place on earth, is 25% angel share. So you could see they're losing a lot of whiskey really fast. I'm going to stop sharing this. But if you, so just raise your hand if you wouldn't mind. Did this whiskey taste young? Raise your hand if the answer is yes, it tasted young. Yeah, okay, so we got 1, 2, maybe 2.5. When it comes to whiskey maturation, it's not just the oak that's maturing the spirit, it's also the oxygen within the cask that's maturing the spirit. So if you think about US production in craft distilleries, sometimes craft producers in the US use small casks and it doesn't kind of mature along with the spirit as well as it should. Sometimes the oak seems separate from the spirit. And that simply has to do with our temperature versus Israel's temperature. And here in the US, we're not losing as much oxygen. I realize I'm getting really dorky really fast, and we're only on the first whiskey. Holy crap. By the third whiskey, you'd be like, yes, Josh. Oh, yes. Right now, I'm putting people to sleep. So before I put you to sleep, I want you to pour the second whiskey if it's not too early. So the second whiskey is going to be Elements Sherry.
Okay, so we're skipping to number 3 on our placemat, but number 2 in the bottle. So in case you had already poured it.
I had never had the core, Joshua.
You never had the core
had-
range?
No, I mean, I've had the cask strength range. I guess I was spoiled, but the nose on that, I mean, I'm a big ex-bourbon fan, but Rich said it too. I mean, it lives up to the milk and honey name. I don't know if that's where, if they thought about that, but it's so buttery. I mean, it's really nice on the nose.
Yeah. So no, actually, so they got the name Milk and Honey, obviously, because Israel's the land of milk and honey. But if you look on their labels, it just says M&H Distillery. And the reason for that is they would do, they would do large whiskey events and people would come to their table and they would invariably, you would have someone say, so I'm lactose intolerant. Is with the milk that you use with your whiskey? But no. Israel's the land of milk and honey. And they say, okay, I get it. And then you'd get someone saying, so I would taste your whiskey, but I'm vegan and I don't do honey. No, there's no honey in our whiskey. So they kind of got tired of that and they changed it to M&H.
What? There's no meat in this?
There's no meat. Well, so there's milk, so they can't,
No mead.
do milk and meat. Oh, mead. Yeah. Oh, no mead.
Honey.
Yeah.
Actually, the biblical honey was probably more a date sugar type of honey rather than a bee honey.
There you go. Well, there's no date sugar in here either. Just barley, yeast, water, and thyme and cask. So just really quickly back to the fast maturation. Because of the intense heat, they're losing 10 to 12% of their liquid year over year. And so where in Scotland, you can put whiskey in a cask and let it lay in cask for up to 81 years, right? Macallan just released an 81-year-old whiskey. Come 10 years from now, if M&H just left the spirit in cask, it would be gone. So they have to release their whiskeys younger. And because of the fast maturation, if they do let the whiskey stay in cask too long, it could get too astringent. I don't know about you, but a lot of bourbon drinkers love bourbon because it's such an oaky impact. For me, that destroys my palate. I just can't take too much astringency. And a lot of people would say sometimes whiskeys, when they get old, they get too astringent. Well, that would happen here too. So are you ever going to see a 10-year-old, 12-year-old, 15-year-old come out of Milk and Honey? Likely not. It's going to be between 3 and maybe 8 years old. They are playing around. They do have stock that goes back to, I want to say 2015. So we're reaching 7 years old with some of their older stock. So let's talk about the whiskey at hand. So this is the first in what's called the Elements series. And there's 3 in the Elements series: the sherry, which we're tasting now, the red wine, which we'll taste after this, and then the peated. And the reason that they call it Element is how it's constructed. So the idea is they're taking the classic recipe, which again is predominantly first fill bourbon casks, some STR casks, and that's 50% of the mixture, or 50% of what's in this bottle. The other 50% is whiskey that's been matured in either Oloroso or PX sherry casks, Pedro Jimenez sherry casks. If you know anything about sherry, the wine style runs the gamut of very dry to very rich and cloyingly sweet almost. So on the very dry side, you'd have Fino sherry. On the very sweet side, you'd have PX sherry. And then right in the middle, you've got Oloroso sherry. It's sort of a medium dry kind of sherry. So with Oloroso, you get these sort of nutty flavors going on. And with PX sherry, you get some of these sort of sweet, raisiny date, back to Peter's comment about date sugar, some date-like notes in here. But what makes this one special, especially, well, specifically to the kosher keeping community who may stay away from some whiskeys that are matured in sherry casks, this is the world's first ever kosher certified sherry cask matured whiskey. And you say, well, why would a sherry cask make whiskey non-kosher? You know, the problem with my people is you get two of us in a room and we're going to have 3 opinions, maybe 7 opinions, who knows? So you have some Jews that would say it's perfectly fine. You put the whiskey in the cask, whiskey comes out of the cask. If it still tastes good, I'm good with God. Let's enjoy. Where some may say, well, in the Bible, there are very specific rules to what can and cannot be, what can or cannot make a wine kosher. And if the whiskey was matured in a wine cask that held non-kosher wine, does that make my whiskey non-kosher, right? So you can imagine there's all sorts of opinions there. And so our friends at Milk and Honey, who don't keep kosher, I mean, this is Tel Aviv. They really talk about their angel share more like devil share. It is party town Israel in Tel Aviv, but they want to respect the entire whiskey consuming community. So they go out of their way to make all of their whiskeys kosher. So to make this one kosher, they're working directly with a sherry wine producer in Spain, in Jerez, where pretty much all sherry comes out of, and a rabbi in Barcelona. And the rabbi works with that sherry producer to produce 75,000 liters of sherry that will stay in cask for about 2 years before it gets dumped, turned into sherry vinegar, and the casks go to Israel to get filled with their spirit. So they got over the whole is that kosher or not by hiring a rabbi to make the kosher sherry. So here we are, tasting the world's first kosher certified sherry cask matured single malt whiskey.
Doesn't matter because the whiskey's not. So just to demonstrate the number of different opinions, I think you'd be hard pressed to find it in the Bible. You know, you'd have to go to the Mishnah to find this. So the rules about this are post-biblical.
Yes, they're Talmudic.
Rabbis debating.
Yep, 100%. And boy, do our rabbis love to debate. I'd rather just drink whiskey, but that's me. Yeah. So
I just look like a rabbi when I'm not, and I drink whiskeys.
There you go. And I just look like a rabbi's hippie son, just drinking the whiskeys. So
Joshua, I told you time and time again, you never got.
Come on, Dad. You can't even say my son, the doctor, my son, the whiskey salesman. So hopefully you guys found the connection between the first whiskey, the M&H Classic, and the Element Sherry. Because again, 50% of the overall recipe is that bourbon cask and STR cask matured whiskey, 3 to 4 years old, and then a combination of Oloroso and PX cask matured whiskey married with it. Now, some people really love their sherry bombs, you know, their whiskeys that are just, you know, dark as night. I'm one of them. I love that. But Tomer Goran, who is their distiller and their blender, is not a huge fan of that, at least when it comes to presenting his own bottlings. What I'm hoping you'll discover from whiskey 1 to whiskey 7 and then on to the gin, which will be the final one we taste, is that he's always seeking balance. So the sherry should be detected here. It should be very present, but you just got to remember it's only an element of the whiskey. It's just a part and parcel of the overall experience.
Joshua, what's his background where he maybe gets some of these theories? Was he working in whiskey before or wine?
Yeah, so he started off as a home distiller, and then he went to Harriet Watt School of Distilling. He's done a lot of time at Springbank, and then started learning under Jim Swan when they started the distillery. So Harriet Watts, some Springbank schooling, some illegal distillation on his kibbutz, and then M&H here. And all of his blendings, he's not schooled in blending. He's blending to his nose, right? He's an absolute whiskey dork. If you think I'm a whiskey dork or Holly's a whiskey dork, I mean, I think he may have one over on us.
Cool. We'll have to
Did I?
take it.
Yeah, we should be bringing him back hopefully in April or May. So we shall
Sorry,
see.
you can't have anything over Holly on that.
There's thanks, John.
These are just shockingly good for 3-year whiskeys. I mean, I would guess they were 10 or 12 year if I were doing them blind. Not that I have the greatest palate, but they're so good.
That's really great to hear. And that's what I was saying before is while it's sad, they're losing so much whiskey because of the angel share. As the whiskey comes out, oxygen comes in, and the oxygen helps the maturation process along. So you're not only getting the benefit of the oak, you're getting the benefit of the oxygen within the cask, helping it along and helping it taste more like an 8, 10, or 12-year-old rather than a 3 or 4-year-old. I see there was some questions here. ABV, yeah, 46%. Thank you, Charles. All of the whiskeys that we'll be tasting until we get to the Apex series are all at 46%. Then starting with the Apex series, that is cask strength. So the ABV is going to jump around a little bit. And then the gin will be 46%. Are we ready for the third whiskey? And then I can go on with a bit more detail on the distillery. I don't want to rush you, but I don't want you to say, when the crap is my next whiskey.
I think we're doing good. This is good.
Okay, cool. So the third whiskey we will be tasting is Elements Red Wine.
We saw
Pour a little myself. So before I go too far in Elements Red Wine, I really want you all to go in and give this a nose, give it a taste, like really try to hyper focus in on the scent of it. You know, if you're not one who can pull out tasting notes, that's perfectly fine. I'm not going to quiz you on, are you getting hints of cranberry? Like the notes you get are the notes you get. That's perfectly fine. But I do want you to nose it and then taste it. And then I do have questions for you that don't have to do with specific notes.
These are all.
So, did this whiskey taste like wine to you? Did it taste like high octane wine? I see some shaking heads saying no. Okay, so that's good. That's a good thing.
No.
Second question is, does it taste peaty to you? Do you almost get like a earthiness or a smokiness going on? Yes.
Touch of it,
Cool.
yeah.
Yeah, a bunch of it. I see Matthew, I see
Absolutely.
Brian. Yeah. So that's also good. So here's a mixed bag, and I'm going to start at the end and then go to the beginning. There is
It
no
also
Yeah.
it smells almost oily. I don't know if that's
oily.
just my
Yeah.
nose.
Yes. Yep. Perfect. I love these notes. That's great. So there is no peat in this whatsoever. Zero peat coming in. However, there are phenols coming through. And when you're nosing something that is peaty or smoky, what you're smelling are specific phenols in there. However, wine can give off phenolic qualities. And so what you're smelling there is, how should I say this? A lot of times when people pour a peated whiskey, they say, ooh, that's smoky. But peat isn't smoke. Peat is an earthiness. Smoke is smoke. They actually are two different flavors. But within earthiness, there's even further gradations to that. And so in this case, is gradations a word? It sounds like one. Let's go with it. So what you're getting is some of the earthiness from the wines that they're using. So again, back to the fact that M&H want to ensure all of their whiskeys can be kosher certified. The predominant whiskey casks they're using are the predominant wine casks they're using for this are coming from Israeli wineries. And grapes in Israel, or I should say wines in Israel, are using grapes that you don't find in France, that you typically don't find in Spain or the US or in parts of Italy. These are Mediterranean grapes doing different things, creating a heavier, earthier, less fruity style of wine. And when it came to Tomer, the master blender here, and myself, because I really dislike whiskeys matured in wine casks, this he thought was going to be his greatest challenge, because the concern is wine is like traditional wine, right? Like Zinfandel, Cabernet, Merlot, Pinot Noir, things like this. Unfortunately, can sometimes make your whiskey that's matured in that cask just taste like high octane Cabernet, high octane Merlot. And we're whiskey drinkers, or maybe we drink wine, but right now we're whiskey drinkers and we want to drink whiskey. We don't want to drink high octane wine. And so his concern was, if I mature these in wine casks, is it going to taste like high octane wine? And what they found is, because of the wine casks available in Israel, what they're getting is this earthiness, this slight phenolic, almost peaty, earthy element coming through on this.
It's got a minerality. I mean, it almost reminds me of Springbank, like a hazel burn, like that mineral oil, a little funk floating around in there, maybe more of like a hazel burn.
Yeah, which gets to what Brian was saying, where he said there's something almost oily. I totally see what you see. It's that dank funkiness going on that is like, in any other context, when you use words like, oh, it smells like oil, it tastes dank. Well, I guess dank could be okay in things people smoke, but that's another thing. It's funny you use these words that don't seem like they would be pleasant, but when they are a part and parcel of an overall flavor experience, they become really pleasant. It's like when people will taste some whiskeys matured in sherry casks, and some people say, oh, it's got a bit of sulfur to it. But if it's just a small part, complemented by the fruitiness and the spiciness and the maltiness and this, that, and the other thing, everything's in its right place. And you get a really fun flavor roller coaster ride from nose to palate to finish. And
You sure this didn't age in Jamaican rum barrels?
No, actually, they have a bunch of Jamaican rum barrels, and they do release them. But no, it is not. Yeah, that funk is straight up wine driven funk. And again, the recipe is similar to the element sherry. It's 50% of the classic recipe and then 50% two different kinds of wines that I do apologize, I don't remember the names of them. But if you are really desperate to know the names of those wines and the grapes, I can find that out and deliver them to you. Just put it in the chat and I'll sort it.
The reason
Joshua,
they
do
keep
you-
coming. Go ahead, Peter.
Joshua, you said you'd go back to your screen sharing, but before.
Yes.
I'm not rushing you. I think you flipped through quickly. It seemed to say that it's a combination of both malted and unmalted barley.
No. So I will share that. No, so it is all 100% malted barley. If they used unmalted, they would not be able to use the term single malt. So it has to be 100% malted. That's why Irish whiskeys refer to their whiskeys when they use a combination of malted and unmalted barley. They just simply refer to it as pot still.
Right.
So, casks. Okay, perfect. So they're getting all of their barley, all of their unpeated barley from Muntons. In the UK, you've got two main maltsters, Muntons and Baird's, and then you've got Port Ellen Maltings, which provides peated malted barley to about 4, I think 5 now distilleries on Islay. So this is going to be interesting when we talk about this. So the fermentation time, their washbacks, their distillation. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah, actually, I want to see your faces when I go over this. So here's something that I found so interesting when it comes to M&H, because they really are, they're, most people's vision of Israel is stonework in Jerusalem and guys with black hats and beards staring at a wall, praying. And the fact of the matter is, in Tel Aviv, you've got a different type of community. Tel Aviv, comparatively speaking to, maybe with the exception of Beirut, Beirut and Tel Aviv are almost sister cities in that they are so amazingly liberal. Israel has a 500,000 person pride parade every year. Imagine doing that in Syria. It wouldn't go over so well. So you've got this town, which is almost like not anti-religious, but they just don't really care about it. They're just, Israeli citizens. But what I find so interesting is they really do pay attention to the fact they want to be accommodating to their kosher keeping brothers and sisters, so much so that they have to produce their whiskeys in a way that no one else in the world is producing. So let's talk about single malt production really quickly. What is single malt? It's beer that has been distilled and put into cask for 3 years and a day. Single malt whiskey, right? To ensure that they have a kosher distillery, they are not allowed to work on the Jewish Sabbath. So Friday night to Saturday night. So basically they work Sunday through Thursday. Now, before you produce that beer, you have to take your malted barley, you grind it up, and you make a sugary water from that barley in what's called a mash tun. And now the typical fashion in which that is done is you take your barley, you put it into a mash tun, and over the course of X number of hours, you add in hot water 3 times, sometimes 4. And each time the water gets hotter and hotter. And the idea behind this is you want the hot water interacting with the ground up barley to convert those starches into fermentable sugar that you would then add yeast to, create a beer, and then distill, right? Everybody got that? All good in the hood? Cool. What they figured out, though, was if they did a 3-water system, it would make it so that every other week they would have to work on the Jewish Sabbath, on Shabbat. And they couldn't do that they had to do it with a 2-water system. And again, back to the reason you use 3 waters, sometimes 4 waters, is you're trying to extract as much fermentable sugar to convert it to a beer to then distill it, because, right, barley costs money. Everything costs money, and you need to make everything cost as less as you can to be competitive on first fill store shelves, right? So they could only use 2 waters. And so they worked with Jim Swan, and Jim Swan said, aha, so if you need to do this, what you have to do is have 2 filling pipes at 45 degrees opposing angles, and the barley and the hot water need to mix midair before it hits the mash tun. And that will force an extra 25% of sugar extraction from the barley.
Wow.
He figured this out by math and science and whatever. And how cool is that they were able to figure that out and retain their kosher status? So, you know, again, these are some of the things that we talk about, this unusual heat that they have to deal with, which is a struggle, this need to retain or be a kosher distillery. They're really against all odds producing whiskey in Israel. I mean, there's a reason there had been no whiskey distillation in Israel before, because of a friggin' pain in the ass. But they sorted it out and are making, thank God, delicious whiskeys.
I'm not sure. I understand what you said about the mashing time, but the fermenting time also is going to dictate when they have to work and when they can let it rest for Friday night and Saturday. So
Yes and no. Yes and no. So actually, once the yeast is pitched, the work is done it's only the yeast that's breaking the Sabbath. They are not breaking the Sabbath. The reason why you did see a fluctuation in that screen, it showed you the fermentation time was between 60 and 72 hours, was during the summertime when it gets much hotter, they ferment for 60 hours, because if they ferment for much longer, it could negatively affect the wash that they make or the beer that they make.
Mhm.
And then in cooler months, they ferment for 72 hours. But here's another interesting fact. Because it gets so hot in Tel Aviv and even hotter inside of their distillery, where there is no air conditioning, I can vouch for that, having been there. They actually have cooling jackets on their washbacks, on their fermentation tanks. And so those cooling jackets, which is commonly used in breweries, keeps the beer or the wash at maximum 33 degrees Celsius, or about 97 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere around there.
Okay, but you can't, when the yeast is finished working, you
Mhm.
need to pump it at least into holding tanks.
Mhm.
So you don't get all that dead yeast doing bad things.
Well, yeah. So that's
it-
the good news is, at least when it comes to fermentation, you have some play time. So if you need to let it go a few hours, that's fine. If you need to cut it off a few hours, that's also fine. Because in the end, you know, we're not right now tasting single casks at a time. We're tasting the marriage of 60 casks. And so if 20% of those casks had a distillate that came from a fermentation time that was only 54 hours, it's not the end of the world, right? You're still blending these whiskeys together to create a very specific flavor profile. So you can play around there a little bit. Are we ready for the 4th whiskey?
Sure.
Cool. So that is going to be M&H Elements Peated, and I've got to grab that. So give me a second. And so here's where things get a bit tricky. And I say tricky because, oh, hold on, I have to finish this whiskey. I say tricky because when it comes to imparting a peatiness or a smoky element to your whiskey, you've got 2 ways in which you can do that. You can get barley that has been dried with peat. So, right, if you don't know this, though, I'm sure if you have teachers like Charles and Holly, yeah, I'm sure you know all of this stuff, but I'm just going to say it just in case. The main way a peaty element gets into a whiskey is when in the drying process for the barley, peat is used, and peat is this. I promise you, this is not a poo stick. This is peat. And so basically, this is decomposing plant matter that has been decomposing over hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of years. You know, a lot of people who are digging peat are digging down 6 feet, 8 feet, 12 feet. And think about this mathematics. It takes a year to grow 1 millimeter of peat. So if anybody has a calculator and wants to figure out the age of peat at 12 feet deep, you're going to have to convert the imperial system to the metric system. You're going to need a watch and an iPhone. And anyway, thousands of years. And so anyway, this gets dug up, gets dried out. Some of it is left damp. And this is, you make a peat fire that you burn beneath a graded floor that has barley sitting atop it. And as that peat fire is drying the barley, it's impregnating those barley corns with a smoky peaty element. So that's one way you can get peat into your whiskey. You're smoking the barley. Another way you can get peat into your whiskey is by using casks that previously held smoky peaty whiskey. So in the case of M&H Elements Peated, they're using a combination of ex-Laphroaig and ex-Ardbeg bourbon casks to impart a peatiness on this whiskey. Now, that isn't to say they're not producing spirit from peated barley. They are. 2 weeks out of every year, they do produce a peaty spirit, about 40 ppm. That's so when you rate a peatiness, you rate it on a phenolics part per million. For them, it's 40. Just to give you a signpost along the way, Kilchoman and Ardbeg are both 50 ppm. Laphroaig is anywhere between 35 and 40 ppm. And Lagavulin is about 42 ppm, 35 to 42. So it gives you an idea of their own peating. But in this, the smoky element is only coming from the casks they used to mature whiskey and that previously held Laphroaig or Ardbeg.
So when people, are asking for a ppm on this, it's technically 0, even though it's called a peated whiskey. So it's right.
Well,
you're not really measuring it after the aging process, are you? Or
yeah, no, that's a good point. So anytime someone talks about a peating level, they're talking about the peating level of the barley and not the final peating level. And Charles, just to give you an example, Glen Murray Distillery, Speyside Distillery, back in 2010, started producing a peated spirit, and they peated the bar. They used 40 ppm peated barley, and then at 2 years old, they released what they just called their peated spirit. And they did a testing of the barley before it was used to make the spirit, and then a testing of the spirit itself after 2 years in cask. And so after 2 years in cask, the ppm in the spirit itself was 18. So it lost about 54% or so, whatever that number is, of peatiness just after 2 years. So there is a phenolic content here, but that's just not the way we typically talk about phenols. We talk about the phenols on the barley and not the final product.
How easy is it to get these big corporate owned casks? Because it's interesting, I saw it in High West once, and now we saw it here and in Eiffel, a German whiskey, but it's not commonplace. I guess I just assumed that it probably would either live its life out at Lefroy or within Scotland? I mean, how are they able to get these casks? Is it difficult to get the brand
Yeah,
casks?
it's not actually that difficult, and it's simply because Lefroy is typically using their bourbon barrel once, and so after that they don't have a need for the majority of those casks after they've been used one time, so they do need to sell them off.
I guess
And
grain
so
whiskey doesn't want that.
what's that?
I guess grain whiskey would not be the next life step
No,
for peated
no.
casks. Surprised more people don't use them.
So more and more new world distilleries are, like Penderyn, both Peated and Kelt
But I
have
just-
been using Penderyn, Peated and Kelt have been using Lefroy casks since 2005.
I mean, High West, years back.
I want to say. Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
There was-
My window isn't lighting up. That's why I asked.
The peat is very subtle.
Yes.
Mhm.
Right. Again, back to this idea that is meant to be just an element. It's meant to be just a part and parcel. You want to sense it, but you don't want to be punched in the face by it. You know, that isn't to say they don't have some heavily peated single casks that they'll do. They definitely do, and they're wonderful. But in the case of this, they just wanted it to be that subtle approach, because, like, raise your hand if you typically don't like smoky whiskeys. All right, 1, 2. All right. Her hand got put down. All right. So for those of you that typically don't like smoky whiskeys, are you finding this one a bit more approachable, or do you still hate it? It is a bit more approachable. Yeah. So. For those of you that don't love peated whiskeys, I have a cure for you. And I do this all the time. I may have done it, Holly, at Gordon's one or two times when you were there way back when. And the easiest way to get over your pedophobia is pour 3 different peated whiskeys side by side. Taste one, nose it, taste it, hate it. That's fine. Then go to the second one, nose it, taste it, maybe hate that one too. That's fine. Then go back to the first one, and you will discover all of the flavors that you missed, because what's happening there is your body is saying, or your tongue is telling your brain, you're tasting something that you hate. Please, for the love of God, stop this madness. But after you have the second whiskey and then you go back to the first, what you're doing is you're giving your brain some context for all of the other things that are going on in that whiskey. And then you go back and then you'll start to taste something different in that first whiskey, and then go to the third whiskey and then to the second whiskey and back to the first. And 19 times out of 20, people end up enjoying, at least saying they would try a peated whiskey again, because that first whiskey becomes something totally different that they've never experienced before. All you need is the context in your brain. So if you kind of liked this and this got you a little interested, try that sometime at your leisure, whatever brands you want. Give it a go and see if it helps you out. And to those who you are the significant other of, I apologize to your significant others, because your whiskey stores will be depleted really, really fast once your others like that. So
The other way to do it is just go to Isla and you will be converted. I've brought people there on my trips who weren't peat lovers. And I was like, why did you really want to go on this trip? And and they ended up, coming back completely changed. And,
Sort of the same concept. Okay, you just keep drinking the peat and you go back and say, oh yeah, okay, there's all these
yeah,
other
there
things.
you go.
Without going to Iowa, I've had that experience with the club.
Well, that's true too, right? We've done enough incredible peated spirit that it should grow on you eventually.
Well,
I think case in point is Vinny. Where is he tonight?
Yeah, he's
He's
in
at
the
the
group
table.
he's at the table.
Ah, There you go. Okay, there you go.
We
I'm
missed it.
glad that everyone in the club now realizes that the more you know and the smarter and more sophisticated your taste is, the more you like Pete.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
Uh, Well, have three, no, sorry, a serious question.
Yeah.
With the STR casks,
Mhm.
does that remove how much of the former peat infused into the
Ah,
remains
yes.
after that, or is that not a process that you do if
So
you want those
that's
coming out?
excellent question. So with their STR casks, they're specifically using Portuguese wine casks to do the STR process on. And so those casks never had any peaty element in them prior. So what you are getting when you shave them out, toast them, and rechar them, you're only shaving a bit of that char, and then you're toasting and recharring. What you're trying to do, if you were ever to break open a cask and look at the staves, you'll see on the inside, you'll see a line that's maybe a quarter of an inch in, that's kind of discolored, and that's called the wine line. I'll call it the whiskey line, but it's the wine line. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to access that wine line because there is still wine caught in that wood, and they just want to access that so that they can toast and rechar and sort of crystallize some of those wine sugars that are still in the wood. And so when you're using the STR cask, you're getting sort of a 1-2 punch of new charred oak, vanilla, and coconut, and spicy flavors, along with some slightly fruity flavors. And then on top of that, and we're going to get even more geeky, these Portuguese wine casks are using French oak rather than American oak. And French oak offers up a bolder spice, and they really want to highlight that spicy element to come through because it balances out that sort of soft buttery quality that Holly was talking about on the first whiskey.
Are they also larger in diameter? So it makes it easier?
Yes, they are. So typically these port casks are what are known as barriques. And if you think about casks, right, a barrel, there's no such thing as a barrel. There are casks, and then you have sizes, and one of the sizes is barrel, and that just means that it is a 200-liter cask. And so an American standard barrel is 200-liter cask, and then you have hogsheads, which are 250 liters, barriques, which are 225 to 228 liters, and butts, which are 500 liters, and so on. So in the case of these casks, they are barriques. So they're about 25 to 28 liters bigger than a regular barrel, wider, more volume they can hold.
These are all great. Really, really great core line. Fantastic.
Joshua, I just had a quick question about the Elements series that I was going to ask about the red wine, but then with the peated, it came up too. Is there been any, like, I don't know if response is the right term, but how have markets reacted to this series? And the reason I asked that is because the red wine being the largest example is, if folks are going to the market and looking at a bottle of a distillery they don't really know that well in M&H and saying it's M&H red wine. Well, I like red wine finished Scotch, so I have a perspective on what that means. And then I open this bottle, and like, if you had given that to me just a dram in a glass, I would have thought it was a peated whiskey. I wouldn't have thought red wine at all, right? So then it's like, did I get the wrong dram, or so I'm just curious as to how people have responded to that, or the peated whiskey being, it knows to me almost no peat, very light, very buttery. The peat was extremely light on the palate. So there's a little bit of a difference between what I think you would expect from the label versus what you get in the bottle.
That is an absolutely excellent question. So the good news is for M&H is the people who are discovering M&H are typically one of two peoples. They are whiskey dorks, like all of us, who are open to something new and something different and potentially being challenged a bit. Yes. Are you going to get upset? There's going to be people who are upset and may be turned off. But that's one of the reasons we always lead with classic, right? It's the lower price point. So hopefully if you're new to that distillery, you'll see classic is going to be, $8 to $10, whatever it is, less expensive than Elements. So hopefully that's your entry point, and then you can move on from there. So it's the whiskey dorks, but then there's also just Jews, because it's an Israeli whiskey, or those that have an affinity for Israel and want to support an Israeli product, right? And for those people, it becomes a gift, right? Like my Uncle Jerry couldn't give two shits about whiskey, but am I going to give him a bottle of this? Hell yes, I'm going to give him a bottle of this because he'd really appreciate it. Would he buy it for his kids, even though they don't drink whiskey? He probably would, because there's that pride attached to it. I think similarly to the way Irish people have an affinity for their whiskeys and so on, right? There's that national kind of pride thing, but their main market and the number one market that they try to appeal to is the whiskey dork market. The people that have an affinity for whiskey and are kind of daring, are interested in trying new things, and especially world whiskey drinkers, right? So Amrut drinkers, Penderyn, Kavalan, they will be open to this because, it's another country producing a whiskey that is different from someone else. And so, the unfortunate thing is, I guess fortunately and unfortunately, the whiskey drinking community is not a monolith. If it were a monolith and everybody loved this, then no one could ever get this. But because it isn't, this is, available to a different group of people within that spectrum of whiskey drinkers. So kind of a long-winded answer, but I hope that helped a bit.
No, that's helpful. And it's it's gonna be, Hanukkah presents for sure. So
There you go. Eight bottles at a time. There you go. 9 if you need the shamash. So
Just don't forget your dad, all right?
Are you really father and son there?
Yes, we
Peter,
are.
Yeah, we really
Peter
are.
and Matthew? Look at that. I love that. Oh, that makes us brothers, Matthew. I love that. So are we ready to hit some cask strength whiskeys? Please say yes. Please say yes.
Yep.
Good. Okay. We're going to pour, and I'm doing this simply because from a flavor profile. We're going to start off with Apex Dead Sea. And I just got a fresh bottle, and I get to open that right here with you all. I'm so excited. So with the Apex line, like again, let's rewind the clock a little bit, right? We started off with M&H Classic, which is their calling card, right? That's their DNA. That's them saying, this is what we are all about. And then you've got the Elements line, which says, hey, if you like that, give these a try, because we added on an element of sherry, an element of red wine, an element of peaty whiskey onto this. And then they wanted to come up with another line, which they thought would be like the epitome, like either the best whiskeys that they could put out or the most unusual whiskeys that they could put out. And I would say that this one we're about to taste fits both of those, fits in both of those silos, because this is an incredibly unusual whiskey, and B, has some of the best casks that they have maturing in Israel in this whiskey here. So you're looking at, where's the ABV? 56.2% alcohol, which is not cask strength, by the way. I would say because of the casks that they had sitting in the Dead Sea, the cask strength would have been somewhere around 74% alcohol, because you're losing water, but keeping alcohol, kind of like what happens in Kentucky. So let's talk about the Dead Sea really quickly. Has anybody been to the Dead Sea before? Raise your hands. 1. Okay. So it's like, it's just me and Doug hanging out at the Dead Sea. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Sorry. All right. We have a Marty Grosman flapping his wings over there. Hello.
Don't shave before you go swimming.
Yeah, shave before you go swimming. So the Dead Sea is the lowest place on Earth. It's 473 meters below sea level. You float in the Dead Sea because the salt content is so high. You don't sink. You actually float in the Dead Sea. And I'm told it's so far down in the earth that you don't have to wear sunblock because the UV rays won't hit you. I think that's a lie. So I didn't trust them, and I wore sunblock when I went down there because it just doesn't seem real. It was about 110 degrees when I was there in June of 2019. So what's that say? Oh, one left now. Oh, nice. Beautiful. So to create this whiskey, I mentioned before, in Tel Aviv, they have an angel share of 10 to 12%. In the Dead Sea, they have an angel share of 25%. So the only way that they could create this whiskey is to mature the same casks, half of its life in Tel Aviv and half of its life in the Dead Sea. And if you ever visit their warehouse in the Dead Sea, it's actually sitting atop a hotel in a chicken wire fence. They just have 60 casks sitting in a chicken wire lockup atop Harrod's Hotel. They are looking to expand there. And actually, I'll show you this really quickly before we, what's this? Someone mentioned The Sixth Sense, and that got me excited. That was a line from The Sixth Sense.
You got to go back to Dave Tobias's comment.
Okay. Oh, geez. I'm going to go down the
Dad jokes.
I've seen The Dead. Yeah, there you go. Okay, good. That was very good. Well played. Where are we? Here we go. So,
Good teacher.
where are we? Aha. So they are actually maturing their casks in all 5 climate zones within Israel. This is one of the things that fascinated Dr. Jim Swan when they asked him to guide them when building this distilleries. He talked about Israel as a playground when it came from maturing whiskey, because you have 5 different climate zones. You know, in just a few hours time, you can go to the Dead Sea, which is, down here, the Dead Sea, which is the lowest place on Earth, and, 100 to 120 degrees, and just in a few hours, drive up to the Upper Galilee and go skiing, right? It's amazing. And so most of their casks are maturing here at the Mediterranean coast. This is Tel Aviv right here. They've got about 2,500 casks on site at their warehouse there. In the Dead Sea, they have about 60 casks, and they just started maturing casks in the Jerusalem Mountains, Upper Galilee, and in the desert area. And so they're going to start playing around to see what these different climates do to the whiskey. So when you nose this, I hope you nose it. I hope it smells wonderful. I want you, if you've already tasted it, fantastic. I want you to go back and give it another taste, but this time specifically focus on the texture of the spirit on your palate. There's a spiciness coming through. There's no doubt about it. If it's burning your tongue a little bit, that's perfect. That's perfectly fine, right? It's 56.2 alcohol. You should get a little bit of burn, but when you give it that second sip, you start to notice the texture. It's incredibly viscous. It's incredibly rich. Some people would say smooth. I like to talk about it as a richness or an unctuousness or an oily quality. And what I found interesting when I visited the distillery and they then took me to the Dead Sea, it's the first thing I noticed, even though the spirit and cask was in the 70s of % alcohol, right? It was hot too. Never drink hot whiskey. Man, is that weird. Anyway, but what I noticed is the texture was off the charts. It was so rich and unctuous. And that I think comes through in this whiskey here. And so one of the reasons that I wanted to start with this one is this is a very pleasant, very easygoing whiskey, albeit at 56.2% alcohol. It's not offering you up a wide range of flavors, but what it is it's giving you a very satisfying texture. And for me, and we talked about it a bit earlier, for me in Single Cask Nation with Jason, the number one thing that we look for is texture in a whiskey. You could have a whiskey that both smells wonderful and tastes great, but if it's thin and hot across the palate, that's not a pleasing experience. And for me, the fact that this one is so oily, so unctuous, just amplifies the experience, even though the flavors aren't like the most complex in the world, right? Could I let Richard Cogan in?
Mhm.
Yeah, okay.
He was here before and commenting. I guess he needed to leave.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I was wondering where his face went. His face returns. Hello, Richard.
Okay. So is this we're looking at the bottle now, Joshua.
Yeah.
Just to see how many bottles were released, obviously with that angel share.
Yeah, so there are 4,800, almost 4,900 bottles for the world.
This is batch. Is it a batch?
Batch 10.
Batch 10. Okay.
So yeah, so one thing to keep in mind is when they refer to their batches, it's not as if they've had 9 previous batches of Dead Sea matured whiskey. Each batch is its own thing. So batch 1 could have been Pomegranate Cask, batch 2 could have been Fortified Wine, batch 3, right? So the batch signifies a change in cask style.
Okay.
I understand that's confusing. If I've got one complaint with M&H is that everybody has been educated really well, and that when a distillery releases something and they do it in a batched manner, it's typically the same thing, just a new batch of that same thing. And so this is just a different way to think about batching.
So is that saying that each Apex bottling, each different Apex bottling is a different batch?
Correct. Correct.
So this will come back around again. Was this the first batch of Dead Sea?
This was the first batch of Dead Sea. It will come around again. Probably not until the end of 2022. So what we're tasting here was a 2021 bottling.
We couldn't get any more. So.
You can get more if you need it.
Okay.
I think Skurnik has some. So if you've sold out, firstly, congratulations. And if you need a little bit more because this group wants a bit more, you should be able to get some. I don't know how much they have, but you should be able to get a little.
Okay.
With the large angel share, but apparently you have teetotaling angels in Israel and they're drinking water rather than alcohol. So the total yield is not, if you proof it down to whatever it was, 46%, you're still getting a fairly sizable, I don't know, that I don't want to put extra words.
No,
You're getting
yeah.
a fair yield.
You are, but you're still getting less because while yes, the ABV does go up, in Tel Aviv, it doesn't go up as sharply as it does in the Dead Sea. So year over year, when we're talking about the angel share, it's a combination. It really is a volume loss and not just an ABV loss.
Right.
Okay.
Since you,
yeah,
please.
Because from summer to winter, back to summer again, and so on, your ABV is going to do this a little bit. It's always going to go up, but it's going to kind of do the worm upwards. Meanwhile, the water inside continues to just go down, right? So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Okay, you've already called us geeky, so that's fine. what is the distillery's philosophy of the ABV that should go into the cask?
They fill their casks at 64% alcohol. And so if you're familiar with what the Scottish do regularly is they fill at 63.5% alcohol. That started off, my understanding is it started off as a flavor driven reason, but then very, very quickly became a logistics driven reason because, sorry, it became a logistics driven reason because now there really weren't single malt brands to speak of. Like single malt wasn't a thing really until the 80s. There were single malt brands out there putting out small amounts, but it was mostly your Chivises and your Johnny Walkers and your Ballantines and so on. And it was all of these distilleries sharing casks with one another. And if you fill those casks at the same ABV, and if you have an even angel share, if you need to share 12-year-old casks with one another, you could do that, and your cost is the same as their cost. So from a blending standpoint, that filling at 63.5, A, is good for flavor and maturation, and B, just makes good logistical sense when you're trying to run a successful blend. When it came to the filling of spirit into cask in Tel Aviv through M&H, they're not sharing casks with anyone. They don't have a blend they're contributing to. So they just found 64% was a good ABV for them and their climate.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any questions, any further questions on the Apex Dead Sea? Do you like the Apex Dead Sea? Okay, who didn't like the Apex Dead Sea? Okay, there are no crazy people in here. That is very good to see.
At least as far as we know.
As far as we know, that's right. As soon as I said that, I saw some people drop.
If this video wasn't being recorded, it might be different, but.
Let me see. There was one other thing that I wanted to share with you from this presentation, and then we can go on to our next whiskey after that. But I definitely want you to enjoy this. Where is it? There we go. So what they're using for their core range, as you could see here, ex-bourbon and STR wine casks. Again, the STR casks were Portuguese red wine casks. That is the vast majority of what they're using for the maturation of their spirit. And then because of their element series, the ex-Isla casks, the ex-Israeli wine casks, and the ex-sherry casks. Now, when it comes to their special editions, be they single casks, be them the Apex, this is actually only a small idea of what they're using for more unusual cask types. So rum, someone had asked before, I forget who it was, someone asked before about Jamaican rum casks. They're using Jamaican rum casks and some Barbadian rum casks as well. Pomegranate wine casks, we'll talk about that. That'll be our next pour, actually. Ex-rye casks, which, by the way, is the next single cask nation selection. We just selected an ex-rye cask, which is off the charts good. And then Israel has, and of course, white wine and port style. And Israel has a huge craft brewing community. So they have a lot of craft breweries that they work with that lend them their casks. So M&H will give the breweries their whiskey casks. The breweries will mature their beer in those casks and then return them back to M&H to get some beer presence in there. So that's what they're using sort of regularly as their special unusual casks. But they've got Calvados casks and Pinot de Charente casks and all sorts of brandy casks, kosher cognac casks, and so on. So there's a lot to be looking out for. But let's pour.
And Joshua,
Yeah, go ahead.
but every one of those casks has been certified kosher?
Correct. Yep, 100%. And if they haven't, those casks will have been washed or recharged. So the wine casks that they're using for the STR process actually come from a Portuguese wine that is not a kosher wine, but the process of recharring those casks nullifies any non-kosherness that the wine that was previously in there could have lent to the whiskey. And then they have some Pinot de Chirant casks, which I'm incredibly excited about because I'm a Pinot de Chirant. I'm not a dork about it. I just love it. But with those ones, they didn't want to rechar them. Rather, they washed them. And you could just give them a quick rinse or a steam. And that also nullifies any non-kosherness to the wine that was previously in it per the Star K, who certifies their whiskey. So I
Sounds
apologize.
easier than burying it in the backyard for 6 days.
I apologize to any non-Jews who just think we're talking gobbledygook right now. What? This wash? What?
But whereas
Years?
anybody
What?
who is Jewish knows for a fact it's gobbledygook.
Yeah, some of you think we're talking gobbledygook, and some of you know we're talking gobbledygook. Let me tell you what is not gobbledygook. Apex Pomegranate Cask. That is our next pour. This was my 2021 whiskey of the year. And so you're looking at 60.3% alcohol. You're looking at only 1,900 bottles for the US. And there you go.
These are all 92.
And so raise your hand if you've heard of pomegranate wine. 1, 2. Okay, so all the Jews. Okay, got it. Most people, when I ask that question, they say, I've never heard of pomegranate wine. A little bit of it comes into the US, but for the most part, it doesn't come into the US. Believe it or not, the winery that they work with sells 1 million bottles of pomegranate wine per year just into the Israeli market alone. So it's a really big, it's a really big mover in Israel, and that's where most people know about it.
Joshua, I didn't know
Yeah.
pomegranate wine. So when we first got this in, I Googled it really quick just to see. And the first thing that came up was Arbor Mist. And so the running joke in my head was that, oh, this has been finished in Arbor Mist wine cask, which could be cool, but I don't think that's the case for M&H.
Well, here's what M&H says about the pomegranate wine. They say it's terrible. They don't like it. They don't drink it. But what they say, however, is that what it does to the cask that is then filled with their spirit, that's what they're looking for. You know, the pomegranate just in both in a religious life for Jews has a meaning, and in the life of Israelis has a huge meaning, right? You know, our apple is their pomegranate. I was going to say our oranges are their pomegranates, but then there's Jaffa oranges, right, which are like the most famous oranges in the world. So it just is a common fruit within day-to-day life in Israel. And so the pomegranate wine producers produce both a dry style of wine and then a sweeter style or a fortified style, kind of like a sherry style almost of pomegranate wine. And that's what they're using with this one, is primarily the fortified or sweeter version of pomegranate wine.
What's the ABV on this, Joshua?
What do you think, if you were to guess?
Yeah, 60, 62, something like that.
Okay. 60.3. Look at that. You would have nailed it, and the Price is Right. You absolutely nailed it.
Yeah, it's probably the first time I've come that close to the ABV on anything. This is, yeah, that's, but it's a little hot.
Oh, I didn't mention this before. If the alcohol is a bit much for you and you have a glass of water, just add a drop or two, swirl it around. That will take the heat down if you feel the heat needs to be taken down. I drink Cask Strength regularly. One thing to mention, though, you can always add water in. You can't take it out. So really go drop by drop. Get it to the level that is most comfortable for your palate. But what I loved about this one is, despite the fact that this whiskey spent all of its life in a pomegranate cask, I'm still getting the M&H spirit character from this. If you put the M&H Classic next to this, for me, I would say, yes, these are definitely sister whiskeys. I can see this comes from the same distillery. And I would say that is the job of any distillery or any blender, is they always want to make sure that you can find their spirit character in their whiskey, even if it's just a little bit, right? Even like if you think of whiskeys like the Balvenie, and you taste their 12-year-old double cask next to their 15-year-old sherry cask, they're going to taste incredibly different. However, there should be that honeyed note coming through in both the whiskeys. And the same rings true here, right? For me, it's this sort of like buttery, malty character that still breaks through that pomegranate wine that we all found in the classic. And that's what I'm getting here. How do we like this one? Yeah, thumbs up. Cool.
No, it's not bad. Takes a little getting used to, but it's not bad.
So when you say it takes a little getting used to, is it because of the high ABV or because the flavors
Because
are
of the
unusual?
the flavor is nice. The flavor is very nice. It was the high ABV that took me by surprise. It drank a little bit hotter than I expected on the first sip.
Mm-hmm.
But once, second or third sip, I was accustomed to the high ABV. It was very nice.
Good.
And it's got a nice finish.
Yeah, I like to refer to our taste buds. We have good taste buds and we have complaining bad taste buds. And the good thing about alcohol is it puts the bad complaining taste buds to sleep the more you drink. And the good taste buds that want to experience flavor and let you enjoy life remain awake and allow you to enjoy this after the second or third sip.
That's a good way to look at it. Okay. I like that.
I added 3 drops of water and it really mellowed out the bite and left the flavors intact. This is really good.
Beautiful.
I have a question, Josh.
Yeah.
Joshua, so with these batches having, more batches to come, are the next series of batches going to be an older marriage of barrels, or is it still going to be 3 years, 3 to 4 years?
Yeah, it's typically going to be 3 to 4 years. They may start creeping into the 5-year range, but that's going to depend on a number of things. First and foremost, they need to understand what their whiskey tastes like after 5 years. You can imagine at 3 years of age, it's already tasting like an 8 to 12-year-old. What's it going to taste like at 4 and 5 years? So, right, they've presented a flavor profile that they want to ensure people still recognize as a flavor profile. So that's issue 1. Issue 2 is they only have so much warehouse space.
Oh.
And because they're producing about 450,000 liters of spirit per year now, which is the equivalent to Kilhoman. Just to give you guys an idea, that's an equivalent to Kilhoman right now. Once they have a larger warehouse space, it will allow them to store more casks. Right now, they have to bottle it at 3 to 4 years of age, just simply to make room for the casks that they're filling, 24/6.
I have a question in regards to that as well. And I was thinking about this earlier when you were showing the different areas and different climate zones. I know in some countries, and including here in the US, you do find some producers, very few, but some producers will actually store barrels, not in a completely controlled environment, but in an environment that, will delay the process of angel share. I've heard, in India, that, you know, there are places where barrels are being put underground
Mhm.
to try and limit the, you know, impact of the humidity and the temperatures and all of that. You know, and here in the U.S., you know, we have Maker's Mark, which uses a warehouse built into the side of a mountain for some of their barrels. You know, some of that is to control, you know, the temperature fluctuations. Is that anything that they've thought about at all in Israel? I know with such a high angel share, you know, it could lead to a longer maturation that might provide a different flavor profile than, you know, and still be Israeli and what they're going for, you know, in terms of their own product.
So they have decided to not do that. They didn't want to control the climate of any of their warehouses. Rather, the control that they're using are those 5 different climate zones. So, you know, they have a warehouse in the Upper Galilee, which is going to have a much smaller angel share just because it's cooler up there,
Okay.
and you actually get snow up there, and so they're, you know, rather than invest in air conditioning and things like that, it's what will that climate zone do? And that was by the direction of Jim Swan, and they feel like they want to stick to that vision because to their opinion, to their mind, they feel it's the truest way to tell the Israeli story.
Sure. No, it makes sense. It just, you know, we work with a distributor in New York now that's doing some, you know, fun barrels that they're aging in a cognac cellar in France, you know, and what does that cellar really do for maturation purposes? You know, is it just a gimmicky thing that it's in a cognac cellar, even though it's whiskey? You know, what, I don't know. It just, it crosses my mind sometimes. Like in Israel, you have incredible places that barrels could be stored, you know, historical, not, you wouldn't want to obviously ruin a cherished religious site or anything like that. But, you know, there are probably plenty of underground, you know, places you know, I lived in Turkey and I was all underground half the time, exploring, you know, cisterns and, you know, you name it. So I just was thinking that could be not necessarily an air conditioned, you know,
but something,
basement,
kind of like
but
what Paul John does. Like you had said, Paul John does have a warehouse that's below ground, like you'd said. That's an interesting question. Well, you know, I've spoken with them about the climates, but I've never spoken to them about potential underground sites that may be accessible to them to do that. Now I have a question to ask them, because that would be interesting to see what that is doing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. it just crossed my mind.
It may give them an idea. Yeah. Yes.
Related question. Does anybody take whiskey out of casks and put it into like a neutral steel container when it's aged enough? It's just gonna, if, you know, we can't use it all right now. And if we keep it in a barrel another year or two, it's gonna get fill in the blank, that what we don't want.
Yep. It happens all the time. I'll give you a very quick example. Last year, maybe the year before, Single Cask Nation bottled a 24-year-old bourbon that spent 12 years in Kentucky in wood, 12 years in Scotland in wood, and then 2 years in a stainless tanker. And part of that is the ABV was coming down. The cask strength ended up being only 47.4% alcohol. So it was coming down kind of quickly. And so that's kind of common. You will find that where you know, producers will have X amount of liquid, but not knowing what to do with it. And if it's starting to hit a ripe old age, they may stick it in tote. And I see lists all the time from cask brokers where I see some liquid in cask and sometimes liquid in tote. So it does happen.
Those underground aging areas, they have to be known as Grabitskis from here on.
Oh my gosh. Grabitski's is perfect.
Right?
Yeah, so we got these casks that have been sitting for 4 years in our Grabitsky, which is the new way of distilling.
It really hurts when they come out.
We're not reserving one of those, thanks.
Oh, I see how it is, Peter.
Are we ready for our final whiskey / penultimate pour? Yes? Okay.
Yep.
So the final whiskey is the fortified red wine. And I always get this question, what is fortified red wine? Port
Right.
can only be made in Portugal, hence port. But in Israel, a lot of fortified wine is produced, and they try to mimic styles. So there is a sherry style wine, a port style wine, and so on. And so this fortified red wine is an Israeli port style cask.
Well, Vinny is at the table there and not mic'd up, so it's my responsibility to say, back in Brooklyn, we called it Manischewitz.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Mad Dog 2020.
Not kosher.
Magen David 2020 is not kosher? Is that true?
I have no idea, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. All right. Been living a lie. This is terrible. So-
Well, Joshua, you know that from small seeds do big oaks grow, because the original makers of Wild Irish Rose was Canandaigua Wine Company, who's
Mhm.
now the biggest wine company in the world. I mean, they own lots of labels you would now know, but that's how they started.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's
That's
unbelievable.
wild. Yeah. So this one is the oldest
First time I ever got
whiskey.
drunk was Wild Irish Rose.
Say that again. The first time you got drunk
Brings
was
back
on the
memories.
wild.
Very first time I ever got drunk was Wild Irish Rose. Oh,
Oof, mine was on Beefeater gin. That was not a pleasant experience.
I was gonna ask John if she had a last name too.
Oh, so let me get the stats here. So
Sorry,
So
Joe.
this-
I'm finished.
this will be our oldest whiskey of the night. So everything that we've tasted up until now has been 3 to 4 years old. That everything in this is at least 4 years old, and spent 100% of its life in these fortified red wine casks or Israeli port style casks. There was only 1,800 bottles produced. So on this one, this is one where I think this may be the fruitiest whiskey of the night. And I would add too, is potentially the more winey whiskey compared to the sherry cask that we had before, compared to the red wine cask that we had before. And I'm not going to include pomegranate wine in that, because pomegranate wine isn't like what we think of when it comes to wine. But this is massively fruity with a hint of that sort of wine funkiness going on in there. It's almost so much where I would be put off, but it's just enough where it becomes that part and parcel. Kind of like I mentioned, spent matchsticks or a little bit of sulfur can be really nice in an overall experience. So the subtle wininess, at least for my palate, is really nice in this overall experience. Sorry, I talked over you, John.
no, that's okay. I mean, this really is very similar to me to the pomegranate. A lot of chocolate, a lot of fudge, a lot of Tootsie Roll. I'm not really getting the fruit. I'm not really getting the wine. I'm not getting port so much, other than maybe providing a little bit of a chocolate essence to it.
Okay.
It's good. I like it. I like it as much as I like the pomegranate.
Interesting. Is anyone other than me then getting the fruit? So for me, I get cranberry. I get a bit of strawberry going on here. Just sort of like a red berry fruitiness going on.
It's coming out late in the finish for me.
Okay. Okay. So there you go. So different palettes. Cool. Anybody else getting some unusual notes out of this one?
Yeah,
Berry
I'm
and
getting very
chocolate.
dark brown notes of dates or figs.
Oh, nice.
Those type of fruits. Nothing very bright.
Mm-hmm.
Delicious
Yeah,
fruit, but that's the level it is. It's not any higher than that. I don't feel any brightness in it, but I feel that fig date, a lot of dates.
Yeah.
Milk and
beautiful.
honey dates. No, but it's that's what I get.
Okay.
Not raisins either.
It's
Which I
close to
expect-
raisins. Close to
No,
raisins.
but not raisins for me, which I expect more in a port type
Okay.
finish. I mean, this is not a complaint.
No, currants.
I like this one.
Yeah.
This wine. This whiskey.
Whiskey wine.
Yeah.
I get currants. I
Okay.
get those type of fruits.
Yeah.
It tastes a lot.
Go ahead.
Tastes a
Sorry.
lot heavier than the pomegranate to me. It's a little thicker.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. I'd agree with that. There's a heavier presence
Yeah.
to it overall. Yeah. So the ABV, someone had asked for the ABV, or maybe, yeah, what someone said either what is ABV or what is the stands for alcohol by volume, as Richard had pointed out. But the ABV on this, so the actual alcohol by volume within this whiskey is 60.4%. So 39.6% water. If you want to see that in reverse. Bless whoever sneezed.
That was me. Thank
There
you.
go. Bless you.
I would have to say that this was probably my least favorite of everything that we had tonight. I
I
think,
always like to end on a low note for you, Ryan.
sorry. So I'm waiting. I'm actually waiting to see what the gin tastes like. So that's that should be interesting. But
But apparently you have no hopes for it.
well, I'm actually I have high hopes for it because I don't typically like gin, and that smells really good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm actually looking forward to tasting it.
Well, since you mentioned it, got to get my bottle.
All right, I didn't mean to disrupt the flow, Josh. I'm sorry.
No, there's no disruption. We're an hour 47 into this. I think at this point, it's all good in the hood, as the kids used to say back when I was a kid. So if you are ready, and hopefully you are, we're done with whiskey, and now we are going to the Levantine Gin. And this is very much an Israeli gin and a whiskey drinker's gin. And I'm going to start off with the idea of a whiskey drinker's gin. So if you're a gin drinker, or if you're not a gin drinker, there are two very specific reasons for that. If you're not a gin drinker, it's typically because you don't like, there you go, Holly, she doesn't like the gins.
It's
Oh,
always
Holly.
smells so good, and then I taste it, and I'm done.
Good. Yeah. So
Hey,
can we do a little deep dive into Holly's hatred of gin? Talk to us specifically. So it smells good, and then what happens?
It's like I get a quick dash of what I smelled on my palate, and then it turns into vodka.
Yes.
No.
Okay. I can appreciate
so
that. I
Oh.
understand that.
Holly.
Don't let it come to fisticuffs, you guys.
No,
Come on.
Never.
Keep it down.
So,
Yeah,
Jonathan,
not rush it yet.
before I just poured my glass
Hollywood
of
way.
gin, but I did have my Copa de Bola ready.
There you go. You're gonna make what cocktail are you gonna make with that?
Well, that's for my fever tree and gin, so.
There you go. So please, for now, just we're gonna drink this one neat. And so Holly, I really liked what you said, because when you say you take a sip and then it's just vodka, I'll agree with you and disagree with you there. I'll agree with you in that, like a vodka, it's basically grain neutral spirit that's been diluted down.
Mhm.
Now, granted, in the distillation process, they're infusing the spirit with all the botanicals that they use to make the gin, but it really is neutral grain spirit. What is neutral grain spirit? It's something that you distill to 95% alcohol or above. You're removing all of the flavor. And because the spirit isn't adding any flavor, the overall experience for some, myself included, tends to be, most gins I find thin and kind of annoying. What makes this a whiskey drinker's gin is that this is a single malt gin. So they're doing their standard process of double distillation. So they make a beer, they distill it once in their wash still to create a spirit. They distill it a second time in their spirit still to create a higher ABV spirit, around 70% alcohol. And then they distill it a third time, this time with their botanicals, all of which come from Israel, with the exception of juniper. Juniper doesn't really grow in Israel. And they infuse that in the third distillation, and then to bring the ABV down. So a lot of times you would just use water to bring that ABV down. They're actually using a combination of water and their new make spirit. They want you to experience their barley in this, along with the botanicals. So back to what I was saying about texture, another reason why I typically don't like gin is because it's diluted down to 40% alcohol. It's chill filtered, meaning they remove all of the oily components that actually give you an enjoyable experience while you drink it. This is 46% alcohol. It's non-chill filtered. You're getting all of the same fatty acids that you'd get in the whiskey, you're getting in the spirit here. So give it a nose, give it a taste, pay attention to that palate, and hopefully you'll be having a different experience. Charles, you look like you want to say something.
What's the combination of the water and the new make spirit? I mean, is it a 50-50? I mean, what are we talking about here?
That's like the one question that I was afraid anyone would ask, because I don't know the answer to it.
Okay.
That
I've never heard
wine
anything
types.
like.
Yeah.
You would, I mean, how would that even work? I mean, because the new make spirit is still adding, high percentage to the overall. So you just keep. I'm just trying to figure that out.
Yeah,
What
right.
what I think I heard is that the regular spirit is distilled twice, whereas the gin has the third distillation with the botanicals in the pot. So
correct.
70-ish is what it comes off after 2 distillations. What is it coming off after the third?
In the 80s.
So that's therefore the new make this spirit would bring it down a touch.
So it's more a maceration, right? With that higher ABV spirit interacting with their botanical basket. And then they distill it that third time. And then it's diluted with water and some of the new make. And Charles, your point is a good one, right? If it were 50-50, I think the new make would come out too much, because new make is a strong flavor. But I just don't know what the ratio is.
The third distillation, what type of stills are they using for that?
That's a column still.
Column still.
It's a small column still.
And is the basket in, so it's a column still, so there's no line iron coming off. So they're not they're teabagging it, or is it in the column lower down?
It's with it. It's before that. It's I don't even know what to call that section of it, but
a
it's
basket, yeah.
it's sort of a basket that's before it.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was a comment about how there's no, the juniper in here is pretty light. And I said, no juniper, no gin. It has to have the juniper to be gin. But what I'm sensing in here is a lot of other aromatics like thyme and rosemary, for example, and probably other Mediterranean and Israeli aromatics that are probably overshadowing the juniper a little bit. But it has to have the juniper or it couldn't be gin.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about gin is there's no specific amount of juniper you need to use to make a gin a gin.
Right.
You just have to sense it. That's it. You just have to, isn't that interesting? Like with bourbon, there's a rule to bourbon. You say it has to have 51% corn in the mash bill, right? This is very specific, 51%. And with gin, it just has to have a sense of the juniper. And for them, again, they wanted to have a gin that gin lovers could enjoy, but that single malt lovers would really find an affinity with. And then on top of that, they wanted something very Israeli. So to your point about the botanicals, I'll read them out to you. So juniper, of course, that's the number one. Lemon peels, Jaffa oranges, fresh, like actual Jaffa, or the flesh and everything, Jaffa oranges, chamomile, lemon verbena, cinnamon, black pepper, and perhaps the most is, oh, look at that cat. It's a little kitten.
No, it's 15 and a half.
All right. Okay. And then perhaps the most Israeli of all the spices is something called za'atar, which is Syrian oregano, basically a spicy oregano. If you ever go to Israel, go to Jerusalem and get a Jerusalem bagel, and it comes with a little pouch of za'atar, and you just dip that bagel into the za'atar and you eat it, and you are in heaven.
Love za'atar.
You're in
There's
Jerusalem,
no
really. But
No pine.
pine or evergreen or anything. I got a lot of that sort of flavor, but you're saying there's no botanical that would specifically do that.
yeah, so juniper, it's the juniper berries that usually give that sort of piney flavor going on.
It's a different than gin, usual.
Yep, exactly. And that is the point.
Okay.
This is the gin drinker for people who don't typically love gin, but even those that really have a true affinity for gin will glom onto this as well. So Holly,
I'm a gin lover. Sorry,
okay,
Holly.
all right.
I'm a gin lover, and what I love about gin is the fact that there can be so different and still so good and so of a particular place. Even more than whiskey, when I go someplace, I look for a gin to bring home from that place. Wow. And this is it's different. It's good. I think it would make a tremendous martini. And I don't think you even need to add an olive. It has that olivey type character to it, or you can add an olive and have it really be that much more profound. Make a great martini. I'd say martini even more than a gin tonic.
Yeah, John, I look at the gin the same way you do a little bit, because I really do like gin and different types of gins from all around the world. And I'm not getting that, I don't know, that flavor that I'm looking for. So maybe the combination that that Jonathan is doing, Joshua's doing, pardon me, is a combination of people who like whiskey, but let's try the gin. Let's get that new niche in there. But
well, there are a lot of gins that are very juniper heavy, and that's fine. That's great. I love it. That's super. But it's nice to have. For me, it's all about variety anyway, especially when it comes to something like gin.
Yeah.
And the fact that this isn't so juniper heavy, but has these other aromatics, I think it's very nice. I like it.
Yeah.
But I do have a question. One thing I'm curious is that what is the rationale for putting it last? Is it because the aromatics would have obscured the whiskeys, or did the whiskeys lead into the aromatics?
No, it definitely is the former. Even if even if I hosted a tasting where I had to include or wanted to include the Levantine gin, I would even put this after the peatiest of whiskeys, because it really does cut through. You're dealing with a completely different set of
Yeah.
flavors compared to peat. So it's, yeah, and this is so intense, I think it may overshadow some of the peat. So this one's always my closer. And it's that for a flavor reason, but also because I often find people who don't love gin saying, you know what, I actually do like that. This opened my eyes a little bit. Now, having said that, you know, it's funny. I'm listening to you, John, and you, Ann, talk about gins. I have Jason, my business partner, in my head with a Scottish accent saying, got a couple of fetishists here. Just talking so passionate about their gins. But that, I think that's a beautiful thing. You're talking passionately about the gins and enjoying it and looking for those varieties. I think that's, I don't often see that.
Anne has tasted various gins in Scotland, so
Yeah.
with people with accents. So yeah.
So the botanist is wonderful, and even what's the other one that can't believe I'm blanking on the name of it. Hendrix is great old Scottish gin. Edinburgh gin. Scotland is a land of gins.
Okay.
It's not just whiskey.
We've seen the botanist come off the still.
Yeah.
But,
I drank it before it was diluted. Holy moly.
Hendrix is probably my first favorite gin, then the botanist.
So I've got a quick question, if you don't mind. Holly.
It's falling asleep there for a second.
Yeah, I know. So I'm waking you up. Did you taste
gin? What
exactly? I want to see if I've converted a resident gin hater, and if the answer is no,
you got two resident gin haters. So
two. All right. So let's
Joshua,
ladies first.
I was going to ask you
what happened, Dad?
Dad.
But Joshua, I wanted to know if the same technique works with gin that works with peated whiskey. Should we bring 3 different gins up to Holly and have her taste it? And the first one she's going to say, "Oh, this is terrible," and the second,
No.
it'll work.
No, I don't. That would be being mean to Holly, and I never want to be mean to Holly.
I never want to be.
see this all I taste here is I agree with Holly in that I take a sip, okay, and all I taste is flowers. Okay.
What do you think about cilantro? What do you think about cilantro?
I don't like cilantro either.
There we go.
He's a 10%er right there. He's a 10%er right there. Yeah. Holly, what do you think of cilantro?
Oh, I'm indifferent. It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, if
okay, that's almost worse than not liking it.
If it's in something, okay, it's like, and I guess very heavily masked by whatever it's in. It's okay, but am I just gonna eat it? This is like that ain't happening.
I have so much.
I'm gonna shovel that in. Oh, I love cilantro.
That's your answer right there.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I like gin a lot, and I drink gin and tonics. I drink martinis. To me, it's so much less juniper forward than most gins. To me, this is so. I don't drink most gins neat, but I could drink this neat. I'm not sure I would like it in a martini or a gin and tonic, but I like it the way it is. It's
could be nice in a martini. No doubt about it.
It makes a great gimlet. I can vouch for its gimlet making abilities. Yes.
Just to throw whatever onto this discussion, when people say this would be good in a martini, martini vary from the traditional 2 parts gin to 1 part vermouth to the people who will look at the bottle of vermouth across the room while putting the gin in the glass. So,
True. Actually, my latest martini variations include a little bit of sherry.
Ah,
And not sweet sherry, but like a fino or maybe an amontillado or oloroso.
very nice.
John, I just need to tell you really quickly, because of your filter, as you're
I was
petting
just
your
gonna
cat,
make a
it just looks
video.
like you're doing this in the air.
Like that?
Yes, exactly. Like, why is he doing? Oh, he's got a cat. That's right. Okay.
I thought that was the gin.
There you go.
So we've come to the
If you forgive
point.
me, Joshua,
Yeah,
I'm
go ahead.
going to
Right there.
to move to the basement. Come on. Oh, still loading. Here we are. Here we are in our basement.
All right. Do you have a cat to pet?
No, we don't. But Anne's pointing to me. This is the still that they use.
Oh, Ugly Betty. I've met Ugly
They've
Betty.
apparently renamed it to be politically
did.
correct.
They
That's
did.
what they used to use
And Perclotti.
to make the
Botanist.
botanist.
Yep. I miss Ugly Betty. I understand why they changed it, but
It's
She was
good.
nice.
The TV show had the copyright.
oh, there's an Ugly Betty.
There is.
Oh, wow.
Did it? Oh.
I
I
doubt
didn't even
it.
put two and two
Oh,
Oh, there
together.
is. There really is.
Man, oh, Manischewitz. Look at that. So listen, we've reached that point where I'd like to ask, are there any non-gin questions that I can answer about M&H
Are you from
Distillery?
Brooklyn?
Connecticut, born and raised.
Yeah, where? Seriously.
Hey, Joshua, before we terminate, can
Yeah.
you make me host?
Yeah. I'm how do I oh, here we go. So I'm from a little town called Naugatuck, Connecticut, but I currently live, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how the hell to do this. There you go, make host. But I've been living in Guilford, Connecticut for the past almost 20 years,
okay.
which is kind of near New Haven. Naugatuck is where Naugahyde came from. So
Right.
pleather.
Right.
You can thank us for pleather. And what was the show that had Miss Naugatuck on it? Was that Soap? I think it was Soap. Had Mrs.
Going
Naugatuck.
way back.
Yeah.
Oh, credentials? That was from Soap. but
Frank Zappa's keyboardist came from my town. One of his keyboardists.
It's near Danbury.
No.
No, it's wrong.
Don't
wrong
accuse me
place.
of that. No. No. So Guilford
Didn't
is
mean to
about a little
insult you,
over.
I'm just geographically challenged at times. But
Yeah, Guilford's about an hour from Danbury, and Naugatuck would have been about about 45 minutes. About 45 minutes.
Up the coast.
Yeah, Joshua, I do have a question about the gin. Unless
Yes,
is, this is available in the States?
it is. Yeah, it is 100% available. So
It's not single cask though, is it?
no, it's not. It's 46%. However, they are looking. They do have a peated cask gin that we may bring in, and then we may be looking at a Navy strength or an imperial 100 proof, which is 57.1%. So we'll see what 2022 brings.
I said it's fun.
Okay.
It's near Woodbury.
Well, before people.
May I
sign
ask
off-
one question
Yeah,
before
go
we
ahead,
finish?
Peter.
I don't think we ever talked about where the barley came from.
Yeah, Scotland.
Yeah, Scotland.
Oh,
So it comes
you said- that's right,
from
you said-
Muntons. Yeah. So
It's.
I'll be very
it's
clear
salted
here.
There, is it all Scottish origin?
No, so most of the maltsters within the UK are getting their barley from the south of England, from France, and maybe a bit Eastern Europe.
Mhm.
Ukraine.
Ukraine. There we go. Now their peated malted barley comes from the Czech Republic, which is very unusual. They recently switched to Scottish peated barley, or barley peated with Scottish peat rather than Czech Republic peat. But any peated spirit coming out of their distillery right now is Czech Republic sourced.
Pretty cool. All right, well, before we lose people, I just want to thank you, Joshua, so
Oh,
much
yes.
for coming on tonight and providing us with such a great tasting. You know, I think we all learned so much. And I think those are some of the best tastings that we have, is when we can leave knowing so much information about not just a distillery, but a country as well, and how they're trying to appease everybody. So really, really, really fun. Thank you again so much. And I really can't wait to do more with you and Impex and all of your different brands that you're working with, for sure. And we're still waiting on that Mocker Bay cask, bourbon cask, right? We were doing a Mocker Bay bourbon cask.
Oh, do we want it
A
to
single cask, yeah. But it was
Oh, the collaborative vatting, that where you create your own Macro.
Yeah, all 100% ex-bourbon.
Yeah, 100% ex bourbon.
Oh, 100%. Oh, that would be so sexy and fun. Yeah.
No
Oh my
sherry
gosh.
here.
No sherry here. Kilhoman and bourbon is
We'll
the
use
magic.
a Kilhoman glass for that.
There you go. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see about
I just
that
had to
one.
throw that in there before I stopped the recording. So
I wanted control.
before we terminate, yeah.
One thing I wanted to add in before I hopped off, if you enjoyed this and you enjoyed some of the information, I'm sure Jason mentioned it before, but we do have a podcast called One Nation Under Whiskey. Holly was actually on the podcast. It's one of my favorite episodes, one of my favorite sit downs. Spending time with Holly is always a good time. So if you enjoyed this, and we have 6 seasons for you to catch up on, but we hope you do. One Nation Under Whiskey.
Yeah, it's a wonderful podcast. Incredible.
Cheers.
Yeah. So thank you guys. Thank you, Joshua. We're gonna sign off. A little over 2 hours now. So we will
Thanks.
see
Thank
some of
you.
Thank you, guys.
Lovely.
Thank you,
Thank you
Joshua.
all.
Thanks,
You're always
Joshua.
great.
Yeah,
Josh.
likewise. Have a great night, everybody. Cheers.
All right. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.